Hey there, and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk about one of Buffett's best investments in later years. And I'm not talking about his investment in Apple. I'm actually talking about his investment in PetroChina, which he made in 2002, where he invested $500 million in PetroChina, which he sold in 2007. But then the investment had turned from $500 million to $4 billion. And Buffett was able to 8x his money in 5 years, which means he made a 50% return on $500 million, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. Now, in the video, I want to go over this tweet from Scott Reardon, which talks about the investment that Buffett made. I also want to show you a clip from 2007 where Buffett is interviewed about the investment in PetroChina. I then want to end the video by looking at a Chinese company that is trading at similar multiples that PetroChina was trading at back in 2002. You probably already know that company, but we'll check it out at the end. So like I said, the original investment was $500 million back in 2002. And at that time, PetroChina had a market cap of $37 billion. And in the tweet, Scott says that the company was trading at 3 times earnings. That's not quite right. He actually corrects that later on. They were actually trading at closer to 6 or 7 times earnings. But the management team of PetroChina had stated that they would pay out roughly half of profits as a dividend, which was giving the stock a 15% dividend yield, which is pretty good. Now, PetroChina is obviously a Chinese company, and at the time, approximately 90% was owned by the government. So Buffett was able to invest $500 million into the 10% that was remaining for public shareholders. Now, like he says here, it isn't a typical Buffett investment. It is in a communist country and pretty cyclical, and they had no pricing power since they are just a regular oil company. And Buffett admitted that he was buying it only because it was cheap, and I've done that myself, bought companies only because they are really, really cheap. But he was buying the company at a market cap of 37 billion, where he estimated the intrinsic value of the company at around 100 billion. So his margin of safety was pretty large. Now, like Scott says here, Buffett wasn't only betting on PetroChina itself. He was also betting on the price of oil rising, and Buffett is buying his share in PetroChina at around $30 per barrel. And when he sells it in 2007, the price is around $90. Even if the price of oil had remained flat or even gone down to $20 a barrel, he was still buying the company so cheap and getting a large amount of dividend paid out every year. He would have probably made a decent return on his money. But seeing that the price of oil went from $30 to $90, the market cap of PetroChina went from 37 billion to 300 billion. And this was just in 5 years, which is not a long time. And there are several things that are interesting and that we can learn from this Buffett investment. But most value investors are not thinking about macro, but in this case, an entire asset class, which was energy, became extremely cheap and was worth betting on. And like Scott says here, PetroChina was basically a call option on rising oil prices. But a normal call option would cost you money, but this one paid you 15% a year to own it. And he also says here that a lot of energy stocks today have a similar setup. So my first thought is Buffett's recent investments in Occidental and Chevron. Could there be something similar going on there? But let's see what the Buff Duck himself had to say about it in this interview from 2007. And I do want to apologize in advance for the quality of the video. But this was apparently the quality that we were all watching on YouTube back in 2007.
Fortunately, I sold a little too soon, but it was 100% a decision based on valuation. When we bought PetroChina, the whole company was selling for $35 billion, if you take the number of shares and multiply by the price. When we sold it, it was at varying prices, but it was at about 8 times that price, wow. about 275. No, I'm sorry. It was more. The original price was 20 in terms of U.S. We sold it from 160 to 200 or something like that.
A nice tidy profit.
Yeah, we made about $3.5 billion on a $500 million investment, as it turned out. I still sold it way too soon. Since I sold it, they must have shot a gun off and said, Warren sold, now it's time to let it go up.
Well, yeah, you left money on the table.
A lot of money.
Dummy.
That's
what
exactly right.
Charlie Munger would say, right?
Charlie would say, you've done it again.
But you can't keep always trying. For the average person who's maybe never bought a stock before, what's your advice about that? You can't constantly sit there and wait and say, oh, it's going to go higher, it's going to go higher.
We don't even think about that. What we think about is how much is it selling for? How much do we think it's worth? When we bought it at $35 billion effectively, I felt the company was probably worth at least $100 billion.
How did it come to your attention? How do you find a stock like PetroChina?
I sit there in my office and I read an annual report, which fortunately was in English, and it described a very good company. And told about the oil reserves, told about the refining, told about the chemicals, everything else. And I sat there and read it, and I thought to myself, this company is worth about $100 billion. Now, I didn't look at the price first. I look at the business first and try and figure out what it's worth, because if I look at the price first, I'll get influenced by that. So I look at the company first. I try to value it, and then I look at the price, and if the price is way less than what I've just valued it at, I'm going to buy it.
And how do you value it?
Well, that's the trick. Yeah. But it's essentially what I would pay for the whole business if I could buy it. And when we sold the stock, it was valued, we'll say, at probably 250 to 275 billion. And we thought that was a fair price. Now, oil had gone up from $30 a barrel to $75 a barrel. Now it's up even further. But today, yesterday anyway, I believe PetroChina is the second most highly valued company in the world. Higher than GE, next to Exxon.
ExxonMobil.
Next to Exxon.
Have you sold the entire stake?
Yeah, I have. Mm-hmm. I wish I hadn't, but I have.
As of when?
Well, we sold it over a period of time.
Sold it over a period of time.
If it went down a lot, we'd buy it back.
And if we take a quick look at the annual report for PetroChina back in 2001, we can actually see a decent growth in the revenue, going from 153 billion renminbi back in 98 up to 241 billion renminbi in 2001. It was actually a little bit less than they were making in 2000, which was around 245 billion renminbi. But if we scroll to the bottom of the income statement, we can actually see that the company had tripled their net income in only 3 years, which is pretty impressive. And the balance sheet for PetroChina wasn't looking that bad either. They had about $1.5 billion in cash and about $2.5 billion in short-term debt, and around 8 billion in long-term debt, which is not too bad for an oil company. So back in 2001, the company was actually making about 111 billion renminbi in cash from operations, which is around $12 billion, and that is a lot less than they were making back in 2000. But obviously a company like PetroChina has huge capital expenditures, so we gotta deduct that from cash from operations to get the free cash flow of the company. Now we can see the capital expenditures here, which are roughly around $6 billion or so, which means that the free cash flow yield for PetroChina at the time was around 16%, which is not bad if you consider the fact that the company was also paying out a dividend of about 15%. So as you can see, judging from these numbers, it was highly unlikely that Buffett was going to lose money in this investment. Now, finally, I have a company for you that's trading at a similar valuation to what PetroChina was trading back in 2002. It is trading at a price to free cash flow of 6 and an enterprise value to free cash flow of just under 5. And that company is a company that I've talked about on this channel a couple of times, which is Alibaba, which you probably already know pretty well. Is Alibaba going to be as good of an investment as PetroChina was back in 2002? Probably not, since they are a much bigger company than PetroChina was back in 2002. But only time will tell. So far it hasn't, but we'll see what happens in the future. But that's it for the video today. I do want to ask you to like and subscribe if you get any value out of the content that I'm providing. I want to thank you for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.